Now, if you or your child has been taking melatonin, don't freak out. As always, any kind of supplement or anything that you're going to take or think about taking, you really need to consult with your doctor. I've said this many times on this podcast, and it's in the show notes, etc. But before you remove anything or add anything to what you're already doing, please do consult with a healthcare professional. However, melatonin is known to suppress the onset of puberty, so much so that regular cycled periods of melatonin release from the pineal really correlate with the onset of puberty and early adulthood. Meaning, as we start secreting melatonin only at night, that's also when we tend to transition out of puberty. Now, there are a lot of things that correlate in our nervous system, so it doesn't necessarily mean it controls it. But in this case, we know, based on lots of data, endocrinology and so forth, that melatonin suppresses the onset of puberty. So supplementing melatonin could be problematic for that reason. But if you've already gone through puberty, it could also have some impact on other hormone systems in your body. So that's why I personally don't like to use melatonin to fall asleep. There's another reason, which is that melatonin will help you fall asleep, but it won't help you stay asleep. And many people who take melatonin find that they wake up 3 to 5 hours later unable to fall back asleep. Part of the reason for that might be that melatonin purchased, you can buy it over the counter in most areas of the world, even though it's a hormone, which is a little unusual. You can't just go into a pharmacy, at least in the US, and buy testosterone or cortisol or estrogen. You need a prescription, but you can go buy melatonin for whatever reason. I don't know the reasons for that legality. But it's been shown many times, and now I'm borrowing from some items that were in Matt Walker's book, Why We Sleep, where he stated there is evidence that in commercially available melatonin, the amount of melatonin has been tested for various brands, and it can range anywhere from being 15% of what's listed on the bottle. Okay, so if they list this is 100 milligrams, would be a tremendously high dose. It turns out it's only 15 milligrams in that particular pill or capsule, or up to 400 times more than what's listed on the bottle. So it's completely unregulated. And so for those of you taking melatonin, I will discuss at the end of the podcast some other potential alternatives that are probably safer and don't have these issues. So should you take melatonin? My personal bias is no, but for many people, they find that it does help them. And so if you do find it helps you, then just consider what I'm saying in light of the other practices that you're doing and talk to your healthcare professional. Okay, so the rhythm of cortisol and melatonin is what we call endogenous. It's happening in us all the time without any external input. In fact, if we were in complete darkness, living in a cave with no artificial lights whatsoever, or we were in complete brightness where we never experienced any darkness, these rhythms of cortisol and melatonin would continue. You would have a bump in cortisol or a pulse in cortisol that would drop off with time, and then melatonin would come up about 12 to 14 hours later. But these endogenous systems of our body, which are both hormonal and neural, were set so that external things could govern when they happen. Now, this takes us back to episode 1 of the podcast that if you haven't listened to already, you might want to listen to, where we talked about sensation and perception and all that. I'm not going to review it again here, but there's one particular sensory event, one particular influence on your nervous system that determines when that cortisol is going to start to rise. So if you were in complete darkness, it would happen once per 24-hour cycle, but it would be somewhat later and later each day. Whereas under normal circumstances, what happens is you wake up, and what happens when you wake up? You open your eyes. When you open your eyes, light comes into your eyes. Now, the way this system works is that you have a particular set of neurons in your eye. They're called retinal ganglion cells. You don't have to remember that if you don't want to, but these retinal ganglion cells are brain neurons. Again, the retina is just the one piece of your brain, actually two pieces, because most of you have two retinas, that resides outside the skull person. When light comes into the eye, there's a particular group of retinal ganglion cells or type of retinal ganglion cells that perceives a particular type of light and communicates that to this clock that resides right above the roof of your mouth called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay? So I know this can get a little complicated, but these retinal ganglion cells, when you open your eyes, light comes in and an electrical signal is sent to this central clock we call the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus has connections with essentially every cell and organ of your body. Now, it's vitally important that we get light communicated to this central clock in order to time the cortisol and melatonin properly. When I say properly, I can say that with confidence because we know, based on a lot of evidence, that if you don't get your cortisol and melatonin rhythms right, there are tremendously broad and bad effects on cardiovascular health, dementia, metabolic effects, learning, depression, dementia. In fact, there's so many negative effects associated with getting this wrong that I don't want to go into it in too much detail. In fact, I feel like we've been bombarded with all this information about how we're not sleeping well, we're not sleeping at the right times, we're not sleeping enough, to the point where people now have sleep anxiety. They if they can't sleep well for a night, they're feeling overwhelmed by that, and it's sort of now they're stressed about not being able to sleep, which is making it harder to sleep, etc. I really want to focus on what we can do to anchor these systems properly. So let's think about what happens when we do this correctly and how to do it correctly.